Cool. All right, we should be good to go then. Is that me? Yep. Feedback. All right. So with this one, we're just going to modify the old. I mean, it's basically, well, kind of stuff that we've done. It's going more into the actually ASP.NET stuff and not so much just C#. So now we're going into form validation, how we can use the Razor templates to actually help build our website more strictly bound to C# objects. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the view model. Oops, wrong one. So we did the prep work. Again, we have the view model here, which is, some people might ask, what's the point of the view model? If you have a model, the model is actually the real data. The view model is specifically a C# object to use for displaying that information. So you have a view model which has additional information specifically used on the view, like this list. Did anybody not get a chance to do the prep work, by the way?
Not get a chance?
Yes.
I want to do you.
Okay. All right. Well, it just tells me how much further I need to go in depth if people hadn't actually seen it.
The model would be what's pulling out of the database. Like in this instance of the list, the model would just be pulling from the database, and this would actually be populating the list with said information?
No.
Okay.
No. So if you have a page, well, in this case, actually, here, let me just run this. I'll show you. So cheese has a name, description, and a type. Those three items. That's not what I want to run. I want to run my IIS Express. So those three things exist in the cheese, which we didn't get into in Numes yet, but either way, we will here in a second. All right, so we have name, description, and type. This, however, is a drop-down that happens to have several different options in it. So the cheese has a set name, a set type, and a set description. But this page has a name, a description, and a list of types. So you can't just use the cheese model because it only has one type that's assigned to it. So you use a view model because this is going to have additional information, a list, that the actual model doesn't. So this, I mean, this model could be, this view model rather, could be any number of things. It's just specifically a class that holds data specifically used on the view, which in this case is there. We have data for a name, description, and a list of cheeses. Let me do this. Oops. And then we have in our view model a name, a description, a cheese type, because we need to be able to store that as well, and then a list of cheeses. So in this case, there's really only one thing that's different, except there's also some logic here in the instantiation that sets or that populates that list based on the values in the enum, which we'll again get into in a second. So the difference is the model itself is just storing the data. The view model is storing data specifically for the view. Because let's say that you had, here's another way to put it. Let's say that this not only had cheeses, but let's say that it had, I don't know, wines or breads, exactly, something like that. So in this case, the view model itself would probably have an instance of cheese and something else, or maybe it would have fields for the what's going to be entered for the cheese or the bread. But neither one of that, the view itself is not showing a cheese, it's just showing information that can be used to create a cheese or a bread object. So your view model might have information specifically for entering cheese or bread. You see what I mean? That makes any sense?
Well, I think we just have to.
Yes. Keep going on the wrong thing. There we go.
What's the actual advantage of having a view model
It's
rather than just throwing it all into the set of model?
well, because this is logic that has nothing to do with cheese, but it does have to do this list right here, for instance, that we were going over before, the drop down. I think you were out of the room at the time. This has nothing to do with the cheese. This has nothing to do with the cheese object itself. So there's no point in cluttering up your object with a bunch of methods that have to do with displaying the data. So you have a separate view model specifically for manipulating data for the sole purpose of displaying it.
Okay.
So that's really all it is. It's, again, separation of responsibility. One that's manipulating the data, storing the data. You have another one that's specifically for manipulating the data to display it.
I heard in the video too, they're talking about it helps make the view more strongly typed, so it's not,
Yes.
It's harder to make spelling.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, his point was like, why not use the model itself? Because you could use the model. Because there's nothing in here that says that this has to be a particular class or, you know, derived from a particular class. It can be any model at all. So you could use the cheese model and then completely butcher it and add things that shouldn't be in there, or that wouldn't make sense to be in there if you're just using it as a regular cheese object because it's specifically for the display. But you could do it that way. So, but yes, the other benefit of using the view model is for making sure that everything is bound to a C# object. So you have validation and all kinds of other things that can come into play.
So in the video, we replaced every instance of VBAG with something like this.
Right.
And which makes sense, it's more concise, and everything is kind of like better organized. With that being said, what would we use VBAG for? I mean, is it just better practice to use view models for everything? I mean, because that makes sense, but I mean, is there any instance where VBAG would be preferable to a view model?
You want to take that?
Yeah.
I know you're not a fan of VBAG though, right?
Well, the reason for that is the idea of VBAG is this dynamic object we get to access from the view. The things that's good for is if you have an error message, like say you have a server code error message that you need the user to say, like you might do something from code, like where they need to see what's going on in the back end. Or say that you have like a user variable that's attached to your controller, and it doesn't necessarily belong to that specific view. It belongs to the group of views. So you don't want to stick it in one view model and then stick it everywhere and it just gets messy.
Okay.
And it's also dynamic, so it's very easy to just say, okay, well, I can focus on the VBAG. So
Okay.
it's also good for testing purposes as well.
So if you're dealing with something specific, view models are better.
Right.
If you just need like a general all-purpose,
Think of it,
think about
before NVC, all of ASP.NET was using something like forms.
Yeah.
It had a front end and a back end, and it was a direct correlation between the view and its back end. Now it's more decoupled, but still with NVC, when you use the view model strategy, you essentially have like this view model is attached to this view. What things belong to it, stay with it.
Okay.
Like that's kind of, so if you have something where you're throwing it on the page, and you need access to it, but it doesn't necessarily belong to that view,
Okay.
then you would do something like view.
Okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. All right, so where were we?
Sorry.
Oh, no. This is all good, actually. I wish there were more questions like this because it really helps solidify why we do things this way. All right, so let's see, where are we? So we're using our view model in our add method. Actually, no, let's not get here yet. Let's go to enums real quick. So when they did it in the prep work, he actually created a new file and then made it its own file with the enum. I generally don't do that. I don't know, do you tend to make your own file and then just put an enum in there? Or do you usually make the enum part of a class? Oh, I use them all the time because they're wonderful for bit masks, but you don't use them ever?
We got it up for a while again.
Oh, okay.
No great reason why. Just don't use them.
All right.
No great reason why not.
Gotcha.
So what do you usually do instead?
If I something like that, I just have a dictionary. Like in my opinion, right now also JavaScript that dictionary can do anything that you need it to do when you use that key value pair. And enums are kind of
Can't do bit masks.
Huh?
They can't do bit masks.
Well, I've never touched it.
Oh,
It's
okay.
not outside this class.
Oh, gotcha.
That's the thing, like I'm a web guy.
Right.
So if it's not something that directly, if you're dealing with web applications, I'm not.
That's understandable. So this is basically just saying, by default, it's an integer. So whenever you list this out, it's just going to go left to right. It's going to be 0, 1, 2, and 3. It's going to be the underlying values, but they're basically named values. So you can say cheese type dot hard, which underlying that name or under that name will actually be the integer value of 0. But when you refer to it as an enum, it's easily human readable. So that's all it is. It's just saying you can list this out. But you can also say that this is like, I don't know, float. Actually, can you use a float in an enum? Oops. I don't know if you can. Yeah, okay, I didn't think so. It can be like byte, short, stuff like that. And then you could say like this equals, and then this equals something like that. And then these will just go back to defaults. But either way, you can set the value specifically, or you can just do that and it'll go in order. And you can specify the actual type if you want to. Generally, don't.
Don't do that.
No, I mean, you can. It depends on what you're doing. Like I use it. I mean, I generally don't because there's not usually a need to. Integer is usually sufficient. Although if you want it to be smaller, I guess, actually, no, I have when dealing with like network communication, if you make it a byte, then it's 8 bits. It's much smaller than an integer. And if all you need are 8 bits to get across what you need to get across, then you're saving time and space. So sometimes it actually makes sense. The wonderful thing about enums is you can actually use, like I was talking about, a bit mask. They didn't get in that at all in the prep work, really. They went over it a little bit in the Microsoft documentation, if I remember correctly. But it's a really, really cool feature that maybe we can get into at the end after we get through everything else. So either way, we got cheese type, hard, soft, smelly, aged. And then we added cheese type here. Notice this is a type now, just like defining a class. And then, so then this can either be cheese type dot hard, soft, smelly, or aged. So it limits that there. And that's it. Everything else stays the same. And then in our view model, we have the same thing, almost identical because of the way that this view is working, to the same, what do you call it, data structure. And then we have the list of selected items for the cheese types because we want to actually have something for the view to show in the option list. I am flying over this. I'm not going into this super deep. So like I say every lecture, if you need me to go into it deeper or explore something, please let me know, because I'm assuming that all of you know what an option is, what an option block is, and or a select block is, and all that stuff. So so then when we instantiate this, because the initial value of this is just going to be nothing, it's just going to be an empty list, so there's nothing to use. So when we instantiate this, we need to populate it with something. So they went through it about a little bit different, manually added each enum value. I did it by using the system.enum type which has helper methods for getting the values and names from an enum type, which was extra credit if you guys wanted to go that route and figure it out. So one of the things you can do with enum is use the capital E enum type. You have to, it's under system, as get values, get names, things like that. So I am iterating through saying get a list of all the values, which is going to be an integer because that's the underlying type of the enum. Stop me if I'm going too fast. I'm serious because I'm just explaining exactly what's going on here, but I'm not describing it in any detail really. So I'm getting all the names or all the values from that enum type, which is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Because that's the definition of our, without specifying values, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 by default. That's how it's going to work. So I'm going to go through, iterate through each integer. You have to say type of because that method requires a type, not an actual class. So you have to use the type of method or function method, which then returns the type cheese or type cheese type, and then iterates or returns a list of the, or excuse me, an array of the values. So we iterate through each one of those, and for each one, we add to this list a value of the integer converted to a string, and then the text that we actually want to display. So the value is the underlying value of the select item or the option. Text is the actual human readable, what's going to be visible to the user. And so I did it this way. There's probably a better way to do it. I just simply cast it to cheese type using this integer value and then converted it to string. So this is going to be basically cheese type.hard converted to string is going to be quote hard. Because this right now is going to, the first iteration going to equal 0. If you cast it to cheese type, all it's going to do is say, give me the name in this enum at position 0.
So
Yeah.
K, is that just like X? Is that just a variable?
Yeah,
that you
I
look
just
at?
happened to use K. It's actually really, I don't even know why I used that. I just happened to hit it first and then I just left it there.
Okay, all right.
There was no thought that went into why I'm using that letter.
Well, I mean, it's like the same for it's like K or Z or whatever. A variable.
K, Z, I, X. You see I, X, and Y a lot. But yeah, for my finger happened to hit K.
No, that's good. I just want to be sure.
I'm usually a bit more verbose than that and actually write out what that is going to be, but I didn't feel like it, I guess. So then, yeah, we're casting that to cheese type, which gets us the actual enum value, not the underlying integer value, and then convert that to string and set that as the text. So it's going to be a list of all of these things in that enum. So if we add one, we don't have to go back in here and add it to that list. It'll just be in the list because that's what happens when it gets instantiated. So when we first use the add, or when we first call the add method, we're just simply returning a view and passing it an instantiation of this as add cheese view model, which is going to populate the cheese types list that we can use on the view itself. So then when we go to the views, we change this to define the model as fully namespaced. You went over that in a few, I probably said that several times, I don't remember. But in here, there is no, there's no namespace that this view exists under. So you have to use the fully scoped namespace or fully scoped name. So example of view models, the add cheese view model. So then I left that in there for the sake of demonstration. What's up?
Do you use multiple models or are you doing something wrong if you have multiple models?
No, there's one model per view.
Okay, so you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you can pass them in the view bag like we were discussing earlier if you wanted to, or using the, the heck was the other one? I can't even think what it's called right now. For whatever reason, it's escaping my mind. The other method of the view, whatever.
Yeah.
Thank you, view data. But yeah, no, there's one model per view. And that's strictly tied. So then I left this in there. That was just the, well, we can do that anyway. This is the, if you return any errors or send any errors to the view in your validation, then this displays all of them. But the main changes that we made were in the form itself. You can replace all of the stuff for the label, saying ASP-4, which is common used through all this, and say what field in that model that this label is for. Same thing with the input. It's an input, what field this in the model that this label or that this input is going to be for. And then we did it for description as well. And then we have here the ASP validation for. This is the message. If any message comes back regarding validation for the name field, it'll be displayed here. So this one is a summary of all of them. And this one is saying, give me the detailed validation information for the name field, if there is any, and detailed validation for the description field, if there is any.
I think since you have the all up there, put at the top and under name.
Yeah. Yeah. And then here's our cheese type. So again, the field name in the view model is type. Same thing here. This is now a select instead of an input. And then we define the items as model.cheese types. And honestly, I don't know why either that you have to put model in this particular case. Do you know, Jake, why you have to like specify that in this particular case that this is cheese types? Like, because none of the other ones you have to use the model. And I mean, it doesn't make, I'm sure it makes sense underlying, but I don't know enough deep down into it to know why you'd have to specify this is part of the model, but you don't for these.
Aren't those just tied though? Because this is the way that this syntax is declared is new in .NET Core, but those are all tied, I think, just to shortcuts. So like there's a whole syntax around links and around putting data in a view that's not actually tied to the view models, like those, or sorry, to specific parts. So those are just fields, correct, on the view model?
Yeah, well, properties, right. I keep saying fields too, but yeah, the properties.
Whereas your model.cheese types has its own, you can go back to your view model.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say that that's just because the way that in your imports, the way that works is you're pulling a class that's a helper method that can pull those fields, but because you're using I guess because you're using enum, like that would be my best guess. Once again, I've never used them. I never even used that syntax.
Yeah, I don't know why that. Well, I was actually thinking about that too. I don't know. I mean, this is, well, there are places that do it, but.
Whenever I do that, honestly, I just use a for each loop and I generate the options as opposed to.
Right.
Because that's new to .NET Core. Like, I've never had that option.
Gotcha. Okay.
Cool, but
Yeah, it makes it super easy, that's for sure. So then this will populate the options within the select using whatever was in this list. That's why it's called a select list item.
Yeah, I'm worried about that. Is that like so that's a special type that lets the view know that it's for select boxes?
Yeah, I don't even know what would happen if you didn't use that type. Do you know? Maybe we can try that out. If you did like list string here and then just put a list of strings and then tried to use that as your ASP items, I don't know what would happen. We could try it, see what happens. It might not break it, but it may not, well, it might still display, but then maybe not work on the back end because it doesn't have all the information for the option field. I don't know. Let's try that. All right. So, yeah. So then that stays all the same. Still submits using a post request. We haven't changed any of that. But now we can bind it directly to an add cheese view model. So when this form gets submitted, it's going to have all the same data that's in a cheese view model. And it's going to be mapped directly to it, same way it normally is. And then I forgot to add in here, we added validation saying that this name is required. And then I just wanted to hit this up. I didn't change it at all, but there's several different other helpers in there to change how it's displayed, things like that. So then we're saying this name is required. So if you try and bind to it and it's not filled out, then, or not bind to it. If you try and run validation against this view model and that field is not filled out, that property is not filled out, then it's going to throw an exception, not throw an exception. It's going to create a validation error. So because this is being passed into here and it has validation set, then we have a model state and we can check to see if, well, there's always a model state, but either way, we can check to see if it's valid. It runs the validation, that turns out true if all of the validation parameter is passed. And then we can use the data in that model to create our new cheese and add it to our cheese data. And then we just simply redirect back like we normally would. If it's false, then we can simply return it with the cheese view model that's passed, because that has all of the validation information in it. We return that, or not return that, we can pass that into the view, and then it will populate. Where am I? Here. It will populate this stuff, these validation errors. So we run this right now. This is the summary, and this is that specific field. If we go back in here, that's not what I wanted to do either. And we go back to our view model, and we say that this is required as well. Then when we hit submit without entering anything, you'll see two error messages at the top. You'll see an error message next to the input for the name and one next to the display or the description, because it's failing that validation. And if you really want to see it, then we can go into the example controller and go right here. Actually, we'll just stop it right up here. And then we can look at our cheese view model, cheese types. You can see the description is null, name is null, the cheese types have the options, and this is the default. So you can see that those two are missing in that view model. So that validation here is going to fail. And if we look at our model state, this valid is false, validation state is invalid, blah, 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 blah. The way my point is failed. All right, cool. So then there's an easy way to handle validation that way. What else did we do? Oh yeah, we added just passing the cheese data, the list of cheeses, into the index. So same thing, that becomes the model now. It's just a list of cheeses, and then you can just do for each cheese and model, and it works the same way as it does, or as it did before. We're just not using the view bag or view data or anything. Yeah, that's actually it. Okay, cool. So you can implement your own custom validation as well. If anybody's interested in that, you can come on over and we can go over that if you want to see how that works. And then I'll experiment. Actually, I want to change that type and see what happens there. But as far as today's overview goes, that's pretty much it. Not pretty much, that is it. Does anybody need anything more detailed? Anybody good? Sweet. All right, cool.
That's a good question.